Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare podcast. My name is Jasper Orthuis. I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare magazine, and with me tonight are Mark DeSantis, Lindsay Powell, and Murray Dahm, the assistant editor of Ancient Warfare magazine. And behind the screens and all the knobs and buttons is Angus Wallace, our lovely engineer doing all the work. And tonight we're going to talk about Ancient Warfare issue 108, which is Alexander the Great at Gaugamela. We have finally arrived at one of the big battles of ancient warfare. And as we said in our sort of pre-discussion, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, it's actually probably the one that has been put onto the great screen, the big screen, better than any other in Oliver Stone's movie from 2004. But perhaps we should start by a quick reminder. How do we get to Gaugamela? Maybe Murray, as you wrote that introduction in Ancient Warfare, you probably have it at your fingertips.
Okay, well, in my brain tip, yes. So, of course, after the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, Alexander doesn't pursue the fleeing Darius, or Darius, however you want to say his name. Instead, allows Darius to retreat to the homelands of the Persian Empire beyond the river Tigris. And instead, Alexander goes down the west coast of the Mediterranean, sorry, the east coast of the Mediterranean, if you're a Greek, the west coast of the Persian Empire. And he takes Gaza, he takes Tyre, he marches down and takes those cities very brutally in the case of Tyre and Gaza, which shows that if you resist his onslaught, you will be treated, your male population will be slaughtered and your entire female and child population will be sold into slavery. So most of the other cities of the region go, "Oh, Alexander, welcome, welcome, welcome." And so he advances as far as Egypt, of course, famously in 332 BC. And that, again, welcomes him. He goes to the oasis at Siwa and worships Zeus Ammon, which is all part of the positioning of Alexander as a godhead and all of that. And it's only after that he backtracks in sort of late 332, early 331, and heads towards the Persian Empire itself. And he's sort of led on by Marsyas, who has a force that we think is intended to stop him from crossing the Euphrates, but he pretty much crosses the Euphrates unopposed. Then he should head down towards Babylon on the Euphrates, doesn't. Instead, he marches between the two rivers, and eventually we find he crosses over the Tigris as well, again, led on by a Persian force, probably intended to draw him into a prepared battlefield that Darius has made at the Battle of Gaugamela. And so eventually he crosses the Tigris, and then he advances further beyond it to get to where Darius is waiting for him. 30th of September, 331 BC, the battle's fought on the 1st of October. Just prior to that, there is a lunar eclipse, which doesn't feature really in the Greek sources for the battle, but we've got a Babylonian tablet which talks about it, a cuneiform tablet which talks about it, and there's an article in the issue about the significance of a lunar eclipse and what it might have meant. And so, yes, we find this massive exaggeration of numbers that Darius has, 200,000 cavalry and over 1 million men facing poor old Alexander's less than 40,000, which is like, wow, why would you fight at those odds? But Alexander comes up with several fascinating solutions to the problems that he sees in the army ahead of him, which of course has been completely remade after the defeat at Issus. And he's got new allies from India and Scythia. He's got scythed chariots. He's got elephants, although the elephants make no appearance in the battle narratives. They only make an appearance in the battle description, like the deployment description. So yes, we find Alexander sort of facing this vast Persian horde on the prepared battlefield of Gaugamela, where Darius has removed all obstacles and deliberately flattened the land in front of his chariot. So they've got the perfect running ground to charge into Alexander's phalanx.
It's really a great pity that we don't have more information from the Persian side about how this army was put together and how they drew in Alexander's army, because it almost seems as if they there's long distances that Alexander marches to get him to that point. Presumably, they've taken the time to figure out where in this larger area is there a battlefield or a place that could be made fit for a large army, and that conforms to certain conditions that have been pre-established, namely that it's large and flat and allows a large cavalry army to deploy easily.
One of the critiques that we find in Arian is that from the Persian side is that at the Issus they fought on a battlefield that was too small, where so that the Persians were not able to make as full use of their larger army as they might have, so that Gaugamela was specifically chosen where their much larger force, their rebuilt army, could actually be deployed at full strength and prepared, which, as noted, they any part of ground was evened out or filled up, so there was no rough ground. Everything there you could drive chariots over it. On the one hand, the Persians were able to make as best use of their force as possible. On the other hand, they sacrificed the initiative in terms of bringing Alexander to battle, because they chose a battlefield and waited for Alexander to come. Alexander actually did. He preferred to have a decision against Darius sooner rather than later. So instead of going towards Babylon, he went for Darius. And I think that one of the novel tactical innovations that Alexander made was deploying the second phalanx behind the first. He still had cavalry on the wings, but he had the reserve phalanx and the rear to protect his rear, knowing that he'd be facing a much larger army. And Gaugamela was apparently the very first time that a Macedonian army had ever employed a dedicated reserve. I do think also, just backtracking to the Oliver Stone depiction of the battle in the outset of his 2004 movie, is you see very clearly that Alexander makes the Persians make a flanking maneuver. Alexander follows them, and then just as the Persians themselves, the cavalry I should say, go far enough along, Alexander makes a sharp leftward turn and heads directly for Darius, and possibly there's speculation that is the Persian cavalry went too far and left Darius vulnerable to a charge by Alexander's companions. So,
well, we said beforehand we want to maybe not try and get too much into the tactics. I was just hoping we to think a little bit more about that campaign phase, because we know there's so many examples from ancient warfare later on where two armies even try to find each other, and let alone bring each other to battle. I mean, obviously, in this case, both sides were willing to engage, which helps a lot.
One of the other reasons for why Alexander decides to fight soon is he's got no water. And one of the other reasons for where Gaugamela is sited is it's a long way from an enemy water source. There's a river behind Darius's position, but Alexander basically has to send back to the Tigris for water. So he has to fight. He can't not fight, because he can't sit there for a week, dying of thirst. So in a way, that's another part of it would be lovely to see a Persian document that talked about that strategic, draw him into here. He's got no water. We will overawe him with our numbers, which seems to be deliberate as well, because when Alexander turns up, Darius's army is deployed, ready for battle. It's not camped, it's ready to go. And so, this idea of Alexander fretting over what am I going to do? And then, coming up with a plan the night before the battle, beautifully romantic, but you're kind of like, is that you really, you were marching into this sort of not knowing? And there do seem to be Persian deserters who seem to have been planted as another attempt to overawe the Macedonians about what they're coming against. And so we don't get really any insight into how is Alexander countering the idea that this hugely outnumbered, very successful, and I think that's probably the biggest positive on the Macedonian side, is they had unalloyed success for 3 years. So that, any attempt to try and dent that self-confidence by deserters telling them that they're coming against 1 million men, even if they weren't coming against 1 million men, is going to fail. And so they are, marching to glory, as they do. But this idea of the Persians going, we'll prepare a battlefield, it'll be far away from the water source for the enemy, we'll tell them how many men we've got facing them, men who have been trained to use the Greek cavalry spear, and we're adopting some of the tactics of the Macedonians that we've seen already. And so, this, and only Arrian mentions the Kardakis in the battle, but, the idea that you have Greek hoplite-esque Persians is all intended to, we're going to beat you this time. And of course, it doesn't come to fruition.
But all of this speaks to, again, that preparation. And first, it speaks to a very modern idea of learning from your previous confrontations with a new enemy, and then thinking about how you're going to defeat him, clearly copying him, and then presumably they must have kept bead on where Alexander's army was all the time, so that they could, first of all, keep track of him. When do you have to have your army ready? When you need to prepare this battlefield? When do you need to deploy it? And when are they coming? When do you send out this whole plan of deserters with fake news or real news, but to try and manipulate the other army?
It puts me in mind of the Battle of Kadesh, where didn't they find some nomads who misled? They misled Pharaoh Ramses, and right. So didn't think that they were anywhere close. Certainly, Darius got what he wanted. Right, he wanted Alexander to come to him on the ground of his choosing, which is not a bad idea. Okay, if you're confident in your army, he should have been much larger, ground of his choosing. Alexander wanted a decision. A decisive battle. He got it. He was fortunate enough to win it, and certainly, I don't think that any of the battles that Alexander fought, the great battles, were easy. I think he could have lost in any one of those battles. I'm talking about Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, and Hydaspes.
But isn't it that his nature to take these really wild gambles and roll the dice, and remarkably, his luck holds?
Right. He definitely was a daring commander, the enemy of the daring commander.
I think that's also part of the romantic literary image of Alexander. I don't think he's certainly not risk averse, but he certainly is not risking his life foolishly within a system of Macedonian warfare which was designed and honed to the nth degree by his father and then by him. And some of the descriptions of Granicus especially is he just charges his cavalry across the river, doesn't wait for the phalanx. You're like, no, that's, Diodorus has an alternative picture, which is he waits the night on the advice of Parmenion and then attacks in the morning. And you're like, that's a far more likely picture, because that's what the Macedonian war machine is designed to do. And then at Issus and at Gaugamela, he does the same thing. You're like, why would he not do it at Granicus in his first battle, the first time he's ever met Persian forces, and then repeat what he does do in the next two battles? It's like, it makes no sense of what the Macedonian army has trained to do in the way that the arms have combined.
But isn't part of the problem that with the sources that we got, all of the sources are separated from the deeds by 100, 150, 200, 300 years. So that there is always going to be an element of the legend and interpretation, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But I think part of that's Alexander's own spin on him, and the funny thing about the post-Alexander generalship, they have to follow the Alexander example. You have to lead your cavalry at its head. So Pyrrhus does it. All of the Hellenistic generals have to follow Alexander's example, and that model of kingship and model of generalship is something that we still have. The idea that are you a general who's in the front line with his troops, or are you a general who's manipulating them from behind? And so there's that idea, of course, of if you're a general who controls from behind, are you really a general? We still get the debate about whether it's Patton or Eisenhower. Eisenhower never commands troops in the field from the front. Patton is there in the front, beyond his front line. So this idea of like that kind of general, which is the more ideal general, still with us. And I think it's a fascinating thing also that, coming back to Jasper's point, the Persians always know what's going on in the Greek world. Their intelligence networks are amazing. They know which city to go and talk to. They know which Greek community to encourage to Medize. So the idea that they would know where Alexander was the entire trip is not surprising. But again, we don't get a Persian perspective on its intelligence networks. We can only read the account of the losers, or the account of the victor betraying what the loser might have done accidentally, but I don't think there's anything accidental about it. Yeah, the vast preparations that are going on, which include not just the modification and adaptation of what they've seen effective against them, which is a remarkable skill, but they're also bringing in new allies and rather than shrinking, even though they're losing their entire western portion of the Persian Empire by this point in time, they're expanding in the other direction and going, right, the Scythians will now be our allies. The Indians will now be our allies. If you look at it from a Persian perspective and try and ignore the Alexander perspective, which is very hard, there's remarkable resilience going on in the Achaemenid Persian Empire. They
probably hoped that the battle would have taken place 2 weeks earlier, just before the lunar eclipse.
Yes. Well, it's interesting we don't get any discussion in the Greek sources of what the lunar eclipse means to them,
because they must have seen it too.
Yeah, they were marching, and again, the self-confidence of the Macedonians is remarkable. If they are marching into enemy territory alone, isolated, and outnumbered, and then there's a lunar eclipse, probably many of them are like, "Oh, this is not good." Whereas in later sources, we get these remarkable. There's a sacrifice that Julius Caesar, who is an augur, so he is qualified to interpret the omens, and according to the stories,
it always helps.
When he sacrifices an animal, it has no heart, and you're like, well, someone stole the heart clearly. Oh my God, no heart! You're like, oh. Anyway, he goes, well, is it any surprise that a beast so feral has no heart? And the men are like, oh, of course, yeah, good answer, yeah. But you're like, that kind of ability to spin, and Sertorius and other generals are sort of renowned for it. The idea to spin what would have been a negative interpretation of an omen, such as a lunar eclipse, is something that's emphasized, at least anecdotally, and there's nothing around the lunar eclipse before Gaugamela from a Greek perspective of this was how the Macedonian soothsayers spun that to be a positive for them. Nor is there a Herodotean, oh, it's the overthrow of an empire. Oh, great, I'll march to my glory. Oh, no, you overthrew your own, which is, what we get for Croesus of Lydia and things like that.
Another thing I find very intriguing about Gaugamela is that Arrian says that Aristobulus, one of his primary sources, reports that the Macedonians recovered the order of battle of all of Darius's troops, which is why there is a listing in Arrian of every kind of unit or type of troop and where they came from, their nationalities. And that is really astonishing, because typically what you find in most reports of battles in ancient times is that who the protagonists had, right? So let's just call them the Romans for instance. But the enemies is kind of faceless. You don't know necessarily who all of the tribes were or all the kings were. It's very hard to figure out who was what. But we know, to the extent that we can rely on the order of battle, as Aristobulus reports, precisely who Darius had with him. and Darius had a very good tactical plan for the battle, and it just didn't work. Now, one of the things that I wonder about was did something go awry? Did the Persian left wing, which is trying to outflank the Macedonian right wing, go too far and create a gap that Alexander was able to exploit, which may have been what Alexander had hoped for all along, but it's difficult to know. It certainly was exploited.
And I mean, the funny thing is, of course, we have all this amazing deal. See, I say Aristobulus, Aristobulus. You say Aristobulus. I've always said Aristobulus. You're probably more accurate. Anyway, the interesting thing is that we get a vast array of detail to a point in Arrian, but in fact, when we compare it to Diodorus Siculus and Quintus Curtius, different detail. So again, there's what Lindsay was saying. Yes, these are all centuries later, but in one case they're great because they preserve material that we don't have now. And so we've got these eyewitnesses that Ptolemy, who also doesn't survive, uses, and then Ptolemy himself is an eyewitness, and they're all used by Arrian. But then you've got these alternate versions in Curtius and Diodorus, and it's like, well, where's your information coming from? And in some cases they name the same sources, and in other cases they name different ones. And so, this was a battle that was, the battle of the age, and everyone wrote about it. But the peculiar thing from our perspective is none of them survive. Only the people who read them survive. And we've now got with Plutarch, we've got 4 main accounts that agree in the main with each other, but disagree on certain details, which are like, how do we? Have
you tracked down a footnote in a book, and it was like, that's not what it says, or it's not actually what it doesn't say what you think it says, or it's not even a reference to anything that you're talking about.
I think it's a problem that I think we hold our ancient sources to higher standards than we hold modern historians, and we shouldn't probably. I mean, they should all attain those high standards, but of course they don't. Yeah, I think there is part of the, I think we've talked about it before, that the received version, it just gets repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated, and no one actually goes back and goes, that's not what he actually says. So can we stop doing this is what he says and actually report what is actually written there? And they don't. And of course, we've got the problem that probably that's been happening for centuries. The original source is then lost, and all we've got is the report.
And you just have the diverging opinions of people who have read it or have read a copy, or maybe somebody in between who says this was a faithful copy of.
Well, yes. Well, even our modern idea of Arrian is a good historian. Diodorus Siculus is a bad historian. Plutarch's not even a historian at all. Quintus Curtius Rufus is a romance writer, which, is this kind of hierarchical, well, we trust Arrian over anyone else. Arrian can't get anything wrong. He's a historian. And you're like, Arrian's doing all sorts of dodgy things. He's calling himself Xenophon. That's odd. Let's just, that's just weird, buddy. And then the other thing is these other historians may preserve very good material. And the dismissal, especially of Diodorus, where there's a general dismissal of Diodorus that every single one of his battle accounts is like the same summary, that all of his battle accounts are the same. And you're like, well, they're not. If you've read his battle accounts, there are some similar, but these are shield walls clashing. They're going to be similarities. What we need to do is get back to basics. Everyone needs to go and read all of the ancient sources and then make up their own mind, rather than a received perception of what they actually say. But that's pipe dream.
Arrian did something very intriguing at the beginning of his work, in that he actually brings up the source controversy and why he justifies why he relies on Ptolemy and Aristobulus, and both of them were on the expedition, and he says something very interesting. He says, Ptolemy's a king; he's never going to lie, right? And which is a very, makes us smile. But it's interesting that he actually felt the need to take up that point, because presumably, I will say certainly for Arrian, writing in the early 1st century AD. That is, he had access to all manner of sources which were not yet lost. That is, that they had not gone through the shredder that is history that we can't see. And he had to justify why he chose to rely on those two.
Well, I'll say I'm going to be a little bit more cynical, because Arrian, of all the Alexander historians, is the last. He's writing somewhere between the 140s and the 160s, so in the mid-2nd century. The other works of his and his own political career is generally in the 130s. We tend to think that he writes in retirement after that political career. So the date of the Anabasis is debated. Some people put it in the 140s under Antoninus Pius. Some people put it as late as the early years of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, which makes a lot of sense because, of course, Lucius Verus is off to fight the Parthian campaign on the Euphrates and the Tigris. Perfect time to be going, hey, here's some Alexander material you hadn't read. So the justification of, and I favor that, because the justification of, I've done the thing that no other historian of Alexander has done. Here's the sources I used. Gosh, I'm good. I'm the best historian of Alexander you'll ever read, is deliberate. It's all about read me, read me. When we think about that, Diodorus Siculus has been around for 150 years by that point. Quintus Curtius Rufus has been around for 100 years by that point. Plutarch has been around for 50 or 60 years. So Arrian has to justify his account because he's the latest one and the last one. And so, whereas we read him as like, wow, he's a very good historian, he's the best historian, there's more going on. And those same sources are mentioned by Diodorus, Plutarch, and I don't know if Quintus Curtius does. I can't remember. So they are mentioned, and they mention Callimachus as well, the other historian who was on the campaign. So there is a literati pick me going on in these writers, and in saying, gosh, I'm a good historian, which still happens to this day. Historians in their prefaces and in their introductions justifying why their perspective is the valid one and why they should be read over any alternative source. We've got the case in many of our works. No one's looked at this angle. No one's looked at this individual. No one's looked at this battle. No one's looked at this. So I'm doing it. So in many ways, we're filling a gap. Whereas in Arrian's case, it's not a gap. It's how do I highlight myself in this field of many, many authors writing about Alexander?
That's interesting. And it actually, your mentions of all these historians on the campaign goes back to this campaign full of self-confidence that that the king decides to bring his, we can say his propaganda department or his historians along with him. Take your pick or your point of view. That they're there is a testimony to that fact.
And not to mention, they're there to write the official history of the campaign. They're not there to write he made a mistake there. Oh, foolish man. Well, you're no longer employed. The funny thing again is that tradition is something that's followed by later later generals and commanders. None of them survive. Our best example is Julius Caesar, who writes his own. But the idea of having Polybius, true Polybius, partially at least. Although again, for most of the period that Polybius survives, it's the earlier wars that he's describing. But we know that he accompanies Scipio Aemilianus in the one after 160 into the 140s. And there's fragments of a couple of others, but in most cases, we only have the people who've read them and absorbed them. We don't have the originals. And again, Lucius Verus's Parthian War, we have Lucian of Samosata's How to Write History, and he abuses all of these historians who are accompanying Lucius Verus for writing just the worst histories of his war. But he mentions 4 by name, but about 8 different works, and they're awful. They're like, I want to read them because these things seem terrible. But the idea of an emperor being surrounded by wannabe literati who are like, read me. And that, I think, to me, that's where Arrian fits. Slightly better. He's not writing on the campaign. He's at Rome. He's, pleading in the law courts, along with Appian, who's writing at the same time, and, Fronto, who is being written to by Lucius Verus from the front, saying, when you write my official history of the war, don't forget my speeches to the Senate. which is a fragment of a thing called the Principia Historiae. So you've got this remarkable environment that we don't get glimpses into, but probably is accompanying every single campaign.
And going back to this particular campaign, all of this speaks to, on both sides, a fairly extensive sort of staff, probably more. It's the royal court, really, of people who both are witness to what's going on and who advise the kings and help them carry out their plans on all sides. And we get so little reference to it. What we haven't talked about, sort of only side as a side note, what Murray said about forcing Alexander to battle because of the position that's been taken, is the logistics, which of course is a famous book that's by now almost 50 years old by Engels. I don't know if he's a relation to the famous Marxist historian, but that'd be interesting.
Let's fact check.
But that was that's quite a feat that he just goes on this whole campaign, from Egypt straight across deep into Mesopotamia with, an army of 40,000 is, by comparison to the army of Darius III, small, but it is about the size that most campaign armies in ancient history seem to be. Seems to be about the maximum. That is, I don't know if that's a very bold statement, but I think it's not a reasonable statement. That seems to be about the amount of troops that you can feed on campaign without causing yourself too many issues. But it's what happens in the Punic Wars. They're all sort of that range.
A quick Google search says no known connection between Donald Engels and the Engels author of the Marxist Manifesto. Yes, I think that's the amazing thing, is that the idea of invading so confidently with such a large army, 40,000 roughly is again, there's different breakdowns of troop numbers, is what can be managed, what can be fed, what can be watered on such an extensive march, which is remarkable for the logistical science of the time. If we would think about it, going on a road trip with 40,000 people, that's just like mind-bogglingly if I give you every resource that you can possibly imagine, organize it would just be like, that can't happen. Whereas obviously in the ancient world, that is something. It's something, and you're in 40-mile or 40 kilometer a day, 20-mile increments. I want you to march from the coast of Turkey down to Egypt and then over to Iran, and you're going 40 kilometers a day. It's almost like, oh, really?
And that's going that 40 kilometers. It's quick.
Right. Yeah. No battles in between where you're stuck in Tyre for months. Yeah, exactly right.
Apart from the earlier benefits of the battlefield that Darius prepared at Gaugamela, that is, we should consider also the logistics of the Persian army, and that is, by staying put, Darius was able to build up supply magazines to feed his much larger army. Now, when I say much larger, we could easily be conservative and say that it was probably outnumbered Alexander by 2-1, right? The million infantry and whatever 200,000 cavalry, I think, is absurd, but it was substantially larger, and Alexander's tactical dispositions would seem to prove that it was much larger. But if you stay in one area, then you can have either river traffic or overland traffic bringing food and water for your troops to this place, because Darius chose the battlefield. He went through all sorts of military engineering to improve it for his own advantage, but he couldn't be certain how long it would take Alexander to actually arrive. Now, Alexander arrived promptly, I think speedily, but Darius had no way of knowing that. So that is, staying there it would mean that his own supply lines would not be growing any longer, and presumably we don't see any, I think, references in the sources of this. We're not vulnerable to any disruption by Alexander's troops. So Alexander's men,
probably that river that is behind his lines is crucial. But again, it again points to if that army is so big, yes, you can plan for the logistics to maintain that army in one place, but it also means you're pinning yourself down. I mean, it's interesting to consider what would have happened if Alexander had said, "Screw you, go stay there in Gaugamela / near Arbela," which of
Yeah,
course
I'll go and take Babylon.
I'll just yeah. What happens next?
Yeah, interestingly enough, because I wanted to actually just touch upon a point of what happens after Gaugamela and maybe why Alexander decided to seek out battle against Darius, is that by defeating Darius, and potentially capturing him, he shows that he's the true master now, okay, of the empire. That is, capturing Babylon would have had some sort of political consequence, but not enough to actually show up Darius. And what happens after Gaugamela? So Darius flees, and Alexander goes on a roughly like 1 week, I think, 250-mile chase to try and capture Darius. I think, and he wanted to capture Darius alive. What I think is that he wanted Darius to surrender the empire to him and acknowledge that he was the king. Now, and probably by doing that, Darius would have been spared, all right? But that is, Alexander would now be the king of all the empire. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why he pursued him so fiercely. Darius was assassinated. He was executed before that happened by other Persian noblemen, yes. But otherwise, that it also makes sense for what was happening, that why Alexander pursued Darius so.
I'm going to be a devil's advocate and put the funny thing about Gaugamela, and completely understandable. It's all about Alexander winning rather than Darius losing. And the other thing is that we take away what we're discussing in terms of logistics and all of that is giving credit to Darius, drawing in Alexander, and then he loses the battle. So all of that's undone. The other thing that's remarkable about staying in one place, no plague, and yet in other campaigns, when you keep a vast army, regardless of whether it's as large as we're told, in one place, bad things start to happen in that camp. And there's no discussion of that about the Persian army, no matter how big it is. But Darius, Arrian says at the end he flees to Media, the mountains to Media, knowing that it would be a difficult pursuit and knowing that Alexander probably would go on to take Babylon and Susa, which Alexander does. So in a way, Darius's flight is, I can live to fight another day. My empire is vast. I will go back to the Persian heartland and rebuild an army. Now, in the end, that doesn't happen. He's betrayed by his own satraps. But in a way, he's like, Alexander's going to go and get distracted in Babylon and Susa. He's going to have victory marches. I can build another army and I can face him again. And in a way, I think that is Darius's plan. That's what he intends to do.
And Alexander probably second-guessed that like a chess move and decided, I'm going to cut the neck of the snake off, right? So
well, no, because in that description, Arrian says Darius considered that Alexander would go to Babylon and Susa, so he went the direction he went, and Alexander goes to Babylon and Susa. So in fact, Alexander does exactly as Darius predicts. So rather than counter, I know what you know, it's exactly what Darius wants him to do, and then things go awry for Darius after that, which he wasn't to know. But I think there is tactical and there is governing nous in Darius that we tend to ignore because he's defeated by Alexander so often and so thoroughly and then gets killed. So we kind of take away any idea that Darius knew what he was doing. And I think Darius did, but the end result is he's utterly defeated and loses his life.
I think the modern word is agency. We take his
yes. And it's a remarkable thing in a lot of ancient battles where we concentrate on someone losing the battle. As Roman battles that are lost by the Romans are lost by the Romans. They're not won by the enemy. You're like, well, hang on a minute. hang on a minute, didn't they beat the Romans? No, the Romans lost that battle. You're like, oh, okay.
It is very interesting that we seem to side with, it's a bit like picking a football team. We just had the World Cup here, and people seem that they want to be on the winning side. Whereas historians, we should be impartial and try and understand a whole bunch of different issues, not just the winning.
Yeah. Well, so to take the World Cup final, for instance, did Spain win it or did Argentina lose it? As opposed
let's
to
not go there right now.
But yes, it's topical. So the interesting thing is that, and is it based on our source material? Obviously, we are dealing with Macedonian sources, which are telling us Alexander won. And you can, in fact, do the opposite and go, well, did Darius lose? And this, comes back to Darius shouldn't have lost. He had such preparation in place. Surely he should have won that battle. And so therefore it becomes Alexander won the battle.
Isn't this the old trope that goes back almost to Herodotus, which is to say we in the West are superior to the people in the East. And of course, they're barbarian people, and therefore they're not as smart as we are. So we will always win, or they will snatch victory from us. So they're the villains in this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the problem is we don't have enough Eastern sources to look at their, that idea of the Persian invasion of both Persian invasions in the 480s and 490, the Marathon and then the Plataea campaigns. Persia doesn't lose any territory. It loses vast amounts of men and resources, but as it shows time and time again, it could just replace those.
Yeah.
The tragedy is with the destruction of Persepolis, a lot of histories from exactly the Persian side have been destroyed, of course.
The problem is we have to read between the lines of our historians very often what they're not telling us, which is, of course, fraught with you're just making stuff up. But there's a really peculiar way of going, this is what we're told. How do you view that from the opposite perspective? If you think about what we've talked about today, Darius prepares a battlefield. He's got an enormous army with new resources, with new, I won't say experimental, because they're proven, but from the enemy's perspective, weaponry and tactics. He's increased the amount of cavalry, having seen what Alexander's increased amount of cavalry can do. So there's learning going on. He's got side chariots, terror weapon, elephants, terror weapon, on a prepared battlefield that is giving them their best chance of success. He then draws Alexander on to a battlefield of his choosing. Everything up to this point is going the way that good generals behave. You've drawn the enemy into unfavorable territory with no water supplies to a battlefield of your choosing, and then it all goes pear-shaped from there. So up until the 1st of October, the battle is going brilliantly for Darius. Everything is going to plan.
Well, if we had the Persian sources, they would probably say that Alexander snatched victory from them.
Exactly right. That perfidious foreigner, exactly right. Yeah. Or that, again, the lunar eclipse, it may have been, it was time. The moons don't lie. Again, would we have got that perspective that the Persians were disheartened, they were unwilling to fight because of what had happened 10 days before the battle? But I find that weird because they should surely have been able to predict when there would be a lunar eclipse. And so, as you were saying before,
yeah, I think so. Yeah,
maybe draw them on earlier, or wait a month so that the lunar eclipse wasn't so close. Yes, so that idea of these unexpected astronomical phenomena in a society where they seem to have a calendar of astronomical phenomena, surely
hundreds
you can go
of years.
Yeah. You could sit there and go, here's our window, fight a battle in that 3-week period there. There's nothing happening around you that will be badly interpreted. So, or maybe they thought 10 days wasn't enough.
Is that we have actual good date for a battle for once.
It's very true that it's a remarkable, and it's so funny how many battles are so vaguely dated. They're not even in the right month. We're just sometime in that year. So we're generally, summer, sometime in summer,
probably
of that year.
Campaign season.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. On that bombshell, thank you very much.
Boom.
See you again next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.